I should probably also say that I work in academic development at my university. So I do mostly staff development, but most of my job is actually spent coordinating quite a large doctoral program in higher education studies. So I'm constantly thinking of how to improve our doctoral offering, but then I also do academic development work and with an interest in academic literacy. So that's kind of where I'm sitting practitioner-wise as well. So what we have seen over time in the development of the field is this rise of socio-cultural understandings of literacies. And I'm sure any of you who are working in this field, this is not going to be new. It's, you know, it's widely known. But in the 1960s, we saw this emergence of this understanding of literacy practices being socially and culturally situated practices. And with that came a greater acknowledgement of the links between writing and knowledge. And what we saw in the 1990s was this emergence of an academic literacies approach from new literacy studies, mainly based in the UK. And these scholars very helpfully helped to conceptually distinguish between a sort of a spectrum of models, on the one end, working with autonomous models of literacy, and on the other end, working with ideological models of literacy. And what that helped the field understand was thinking through what students are required to do in university spaces and how a lot of the focus up until this point had been on language ability, purely language instruction. If you just learn, in our case, the English language and become proficient, you will succeed. So the focus was very much on technical language. It was focused on spelling, grammar, that sort of sentence construction. And the idea was that was informing that sort of focus was that literacies and reading and writing are just cognitive processes. It's inputting information and then just sort of displaying that information through writing. So it was purely a sort of cognitive ability. And with that, an understanding that it was very neutral. So it didn't matter where you were based. It didn't matter where your training would come from. It was a neutral skill set. You just had to go and learn the skill set, and then you would be able to succeed. And what these scholars criticized about that model is they critiqued it, saying it's much more than just a neutral skill. It's much more than just a cognitive ability. Literacy practices are always embedded within a social context. They are always in relation to different players in the field, and with that comes power relations as well. And that's why they called it an ideological model, because they were saying it's always serving some sort of interests. And you can already sort of see the connections to LCT there, and particularly in sort of fields and legitimation and that sort of thing. So they were pointing to those sorts of issues. And this work and understanding was furthered by James G., who argued that there was also this concept, he used a concept of discourse. And what he used that concept for was to explain that there's also a socially recognizable identity or a particular way of being and doing in academia that holds particular kinds of values. So it's not only that these practices are socially embedded and contextualized, but also you are asking students that are coming into the space to become particular kinds of people. We want them to think and act and write and argue and critically engage in a particular way. And that's not neutral. That's not a skill set. It's a way of being in the world. So G was really useful for furthering those understandings with this concept of discourse. So when we have a look at the academic literacies approach that came out of this group of scholars, there were some real positives associated with this approach. The main one being that because of this understanding of the ideological model, the focus then shifted as well from from the textual output more to the practice of doing the academic literacies work. So what does it mean when you actually do writing in an institution? And what that helped do is it moved scholars away from sort of a normative identify and induct text-based approach. So instead of looking at a text and teaching to a text, the approach that was advocated was more, let's have a look at what does it mean to be situated in a discipline? What does it mean to work with disciplinary knowledge? What does it mean to be a biologist or to be a sociologist? So it sort of gave a more holistic approach to understanding that. And the scholars argued that that was transformative in that it encouraged students to challenge hegemonic practices in institutions. And as I said, it was pushing the sort of understanding of disciplinary knowledge rather than a technicist text-based approach. So that if you linguists in the room, you might be cringing a little bit at this point, and that's fun. Because it's also been critiqued itself. So other scholars, particularly genre-based linguists, have criticized academic literacy's approach as unfairly dismissing the text-based approaches. I think, especially in more recent years, a lot of advancements have been made in those approaches that have been hugely useful and are not the very sort of strict induct, identify and induct approach. They're much more nuanced than that. And the academic literacies theorists have also been criticized for losing touch with the text entirely. And it's definitely something I've been finding in my practice is I get the disciplinary knowledge stuff, I get the social identity stuff, I get all that, and I'm a very strong advocate of it. But when you see where students are coming in from, they need some basic things before you can sort of engage in these bigger conversations. And that's where I think the text work becomes quite critical. And so I would agree with that. And then that also leads to the next point there, that if you don't understand something, how do you then go about criticizing it? So if you're not actually inducting to a degree so that students know what they actually are dealing with, how are you going to get that transformative approach coming in where they can actually start challenging what they're doing? The academic literacy approach was also criticized for being pedagogically underdeveloped. It sort of stays at quite a theoretical level, a sort of an ideal to be working within. And they don't give much sort of practical pedagogical implementation of that approach. So individual scholars have sort of tried to work with it on their own. And it's also been seen to favor sort of resource-rich environments. So because to do that sort of more identity work, the dispositional work, it takes time and it takes quite a lot of input. And so the idea there is if you're working with a small group of students, it's very possible to do that work. If you're working with a class of 700, it's much more difficult. And so it has been criticized in that respect as well. I promise I will get to the LCT shortly. So just to sort of wrap up a little bit on the academic literacies front, because I really am trying to think of, well, you know, where do we go from here? So the uptake of academic literacies has been huge in South Africa. It's for the past 20 years, 30 years. And it's been huge here because it has provided a socio-cultural understanding of literacies that very usefully pushed back against a deficit model in our context. For a long time, Black students that were entering into the higher education space after the end of apartheid were seen as lacking something. That's why we call it the deficit model. So the understanding was that they lack something, we need to fill that gap, and then they will be fine. And one of the big arguments at the time was they lack language ability. So let's just pluck them out of their disciplines, put them in a language course, and they'll be fine. And nobody stopped to think about sort of what it meant to enter into a university space, what that identity imposition would be, the fact that these are not neutral practices, that the way we write in history is going to be slightly different to how we write in linguistics, and we never kind of make that stuff clear. And so the scholars working at the time and up until now, we're really looking for something that pushed back against that that discourse. And so it really has become quite an influential theoretical framework in this context. But I've been finding in my work that it falls short, and it's many of the criticisms that we've already gone through have already captured that. But I find it does fall short, and I really think LCT can play a very useful role in plugging some of the holes in terms of practice. So I kind of see LCT as providing a bit of a bridge from these grand, lofty ideals, which I fundamentally believe in, but are frustrated with because I feel like I'm a bit stifled in terms of what to do with that. And then we've got a framework like LCT that is so practically minded, but also can work at a very theoretical level. And I think they can work so nicely together. And I think LCT can extend and expand on what the academic literacies theory can do. So I think it's well suited because of its social realist ontology. So it gets at the social aspects of knowledge, but it also appreciates the fact that knowledge has real properties and qualities of itself. So it's not just like this relativist thing that is constructed by the knowers. There actually are real qualities to it. It also provides the tools that academic literacies doesn't have, that gets at many of the features and shows them in explicit terms. So I think that's where it just takes it a step further. And by doing that, we can start to generate insights into how knowledge and disciplinary identities are encoded in writing. So I think it's all very well talking about writing being embedded in a discipline, that it's influenced, that we have to take note of disciplinary features and that sort of thing. But we need a way to see it in the writing to make this really clear to students. And with that, LCT also plugs that criticism that academic literacies has lost the textual focus. I think LCT can help bring that textual focus back in quite a powerful way. And then it has strong pedagogical application that I would argue doesn't rely on resource-rich environments. Certainly with my work on semantics, I'm doing workshops to 80 students at a time or more. And I think the reach through these tools, because they're so sort of tangible and practical, you can reach quite a lot in a group setting. You don't have to be in like a small tutorial group. Right, so now getting more to the point of why you all came, I'm sure, for the LCT. So just to give you some background as to what I'll be using as the data to make this argument, is I'm drawing on my PhD study, which looked at 25 exemplary doctoral dissertations from the humanities and social sciences. And what I'm basing this on is one part of the analysis that I did. In the PhD, I identified five sort of parts of a thesis that all theses do. Doesn't matter what discipline they're from, they all do five main things. One of those five main things is constructing a rationale. Sometimes it's called a literature review, sometimes it's called something else, but it's essentially where they are making a case for why the study is worth doing and showing how it fits in with what's come before. But what I'm trying to do now is, as I said at the beginning, is repurpose that analysis for this argument about academic literacies in particular. And I'm hoping the analysis I'm going to move into now, I'm trying to argue that it's showing many of the things academic literacy speaks to but can't show necessarily in practical terms. So what I used is specialization first off. And while that was very useful as a starting point, I soon realized I was going to need something more, particularly to make sense of very different dissertations from different disciplines and subject areas. And even within subject areas, they can be so different. And that then led me to the 4K model. So just as a reminder, that's where we're going. Just as a reminder, then specialization, I'm sure most of you are well aware of all of this. But what I
Don't. By the way,
found,
Kirstin, don't feel bad
yeah,
about just reminding people because you never
okay,
know. It's better to slightly bore the people who know very well rather than just lose the people who don't.
okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the data already, so maybe that will help as well. Um, so essentially, epistemic relations to objects of knowledge, social relations to ways of knowing or people involved. So in this case, when I read these dissertations and tried to make sense of how they were constructing their rationale, what I found is when candidates foregrounded epistemic relations, they tended to emphasize what could be described as knowledge or what could be described as a legitimate sort of study. So what they were doing there is they were typically foregrounding knowledge practices such as specialist methods or theories that were then going to be used to generate particular kinds of findings, or they were emphasizing new topics that had sort of never been studied before. Um, so new objects or new phenomena that were yet to be studied, and that's what gave it its significance or legitimacy in the field. And so those that was dealing with the epistemic relations. And when candidates foregrounded social relations, they tended to emphasize who could be a legitimate knower in a given field. And they tended to do that in two main ways. They would foreground particular subjects, authors, or actors and their personal characteristics, such as class, race, gender. So, kind of the legitimacy came from who the author was. In this case, I'll use author and candidate interchangeably, but the person who wrote the PhD, essentially. So they were really pointing to a fact that it's something about the person in particular. Or they could, another way they could do it was they could highlight interactions with others that had shaped their way of thinking. So that was less about who they were as a person and more about how they had come to know over time. So it was more about a particular kind of gaze that they were working with there, that they were emphasizing was needed for this particular research problem that they were dealing with. So those of you who are familiar with specialization can already see why I just moved on over into the 4K model, because it was the sort of data was really going that way. So what that sort of led me to understand is that there were four very broad brushstrokes, sort of high level writing strategies is what I called them, at play here. In the way that these students were, or candidates were, setting up their study, setting up the rationale for why their study was important and why it was legitimate at this time in this space. So starting at the top there, the interactional relations, when they were highlighting ways of knowing, I called that, or highlighting relations to knowing, I called that a ways of knowing strategy. When they were foregrounding subjective relations to knowers, I called that a voices strategy. Highlighting discursive relations to knowledges, I called that approaches to topic. And when they were foregrounding ontic relations to known objects, I called that nature of topics. So, and I'll show you how I sort of got here. when we go into the nitty-gritty. So this was the translation device that I developed. I kind of used, I know a lot of people use the 4K model. I'm still like a bit terrified of it because it always seems quite complex and scary. I feel like I used it in quite a simple way. Maybe it's just because I know the data well, so it seems more simple to me. But essentially, when ontic relations were being strengthened, that is when candidates were foregrounding aspects related to objects of knowledge. So when they were really pushing a specific topic or a specific problem situation. And so what they were doing effectively then is they were strengthening the sort of boundaries of what could be considered a legitimate object of study or not, a legitimate topic or not. And quite often the argument was made that it had never been done before. So that's why it was now needed. So for example, here, I had a history study from that was looking at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa after the end of apartheid. That commission interviewed a whole lot of key players in apartheid, many of which had horrendous crimes against them. And it was kind of an opportunity for them to own up to their crimes and get a pardon. It was quite a unique sort of setup. But through that commission, they had heaps of investigations and research going into what these sort of war crimes, or whatever you'd want to call it, crimes against humanity were. So a whole lot of stuff got uncovered. So this student here was saying she documented some of the stuff that was going on in that trial. So she could say, this is never seen before historical knowledge, and made a case for that. When ontic relations were weakened, candidates downplayed aspects relating to objects of knowledge. So they downplayed the fact that there was a definite, tightly bounded, legitimate object. So, for example, this study was in African studies, which would be more like cultural studies somewhere else. And the author says, I have no idea why I chose to look specifically at these images, because her study was based on a set of images from her family, a family photograph. Why am I resorting to the study of these flimsy pieces of fading and stained paper as a way to resolve my seemingly endless, seeming struggles of metaphorical homelessness? So there was a sense of, I've picked something almost at random. So it wasn't like, she wasn't making a case of this is important because of the object of study. You'll see later in the talk, she made a different kind of argument and rationale. When discursive relations were being strengthened, that's when authors would foreground a specialist approach for their study. So they're saying this study is really important because I am using this kind of methodological approach, or I'm using this particular kind of theory. And I remember at the time debating with Carl about where an LCT study would fit. I often thought it would be, we often emphasize what LCT can do. So I thought maybe it would fit in with the DR plus. But the fact that we always work from problems, Carl always felt as an OR plus. But anyway, that's just a little anecdote aside.
I'm gonna the chapter, one of the chapters in the book will mention that at some point.
Okay,
but
excellent.
I drumbeat problems. Problems are my religion.
So this is really when an approach was being foregrounded, and then opposite to that, downplaying discursive relations when a particular approach was not the thing that was going to do the job. Instead, multiple different approaches need to be used. One can't do the job. So it's kind of like we'll pick from here and we'll pick from there and we'll pick from there. And obviously, all of these things are at play because we know that epistemic relations and social relations are always at play together. And so I remember a comment in LCT 5, someone said, yes, but quite often it is about the object of study. And yes, I think every PhD has a bit of an object of study being highlighted, but I was really trying to get to the basis of what made this study special. And I found that helpful to tease apart what is like the core thing that makes this study special. Because a lot of the times in particularly humanities and social science, you're not really doing a groundbreaking new topic that nobody has ever studied before. You kind of slicing it in a different way or coming at it from a different approach, using a slightly different data set. There's something more nuanced. And I think the LCT and this level of detail, delicacy helped me sort of pinpoint that core sort of basis. All right, so that's quite a mouthful, that table. So let's just have a look. So I've already gone over this, strengthening ontic relations, emphasizing a new topic. They are discussing literature then in relation to what other research has revealed about the topic or not, and why. And then they use that literature to build a foundation for what is already known about the topic. And then that allows the candidate to make an argument about what is the gap, what is yet to be explored. So let's just have a look at what this might look like. So this was a history PhD that was looking at a particular figure in the apartheid struggle, Henry Selby Msimang. And the author starts by explaining that this person's biography in the political history has been neglected. And he gives a few reasons why the neglect has happened. And we get a sense here, it was pretty much because this person had viewpoints that didn't quite fit the discourse and the narrative of the time. So what we see here is he starts by saying it's been neglected. So he starts to make a case for the fact that this is a missing object of study in the field. And then he starts to give some reasons why it was neglected and why it has been downplayed in the field. So he's kind of building up an argument that there are many biographies that exist on this topic, but this particular perspective is missing, and there's a reason why it's missing. And then the new study is sort of put alongside that to say, this figure is missing. This is why he is missing from the historical archives. And this thesis is precisely dealing with this gap in the knowledge base. So it's all about filling an object of knowledge in the existing knowledge base. And I'm not going to read through them because I'm just trying to keep an eye on time. I think I need to speed up a little bit. Different to approaches to topic, that's where we're getting the strengthening of discursive relations, where they are pushing the method, essentially. The study is significant because other existing literature has not provided a method, a theory, a way of working with knowledge to generate findings that are necessary for the field. So the basis of the argument is about the procedure for generating new knowledge. And then the new study is positioned as providing that mechanism in the field. And it can be theoretical or methodological. So let's just have a look here. This was from a psychology PhD that was looking at a study of decision-making around parenthood. And the study was using Butler's theory of masculinities and performativity, gender performativity. And the author here makes an argument that research that has currently been done, although it explicitly connects gender constructions and parenthood, so that would be a good thing, it continues a problem-orientated approach that concentrates on men who are already fathers, and it particularly looks at economically disadvantaged men. So she's saying that approach favors a particular perspective. She's also saying it's influenced by men and masculinity studies, and because of that, men form the focal point, and because of that, women and their perspectives are sidelined. So again, it's the way the research is being done is leading to blind spots in the findings. And then she counters that with her approach. And just keep in mind, these are PhDs. I'm pulling out 2 quotes from an 80,000 word document. So it's just to illustrate. It's done with a lot more nuance, obviously. But here you can see she sets up her theory. She, Butler, repudiates the foundation of the sex biology distinction, which seems to creep in the back door of other approaches. This theory, identity is always brought at the price of exclusion of the other. And so what this approach allows is for an understanding of gender as thoroughly relational. And then the author argues this is a crucial aspect that is being neglected by other people working in other approaches. So she's really pushing the approach and the way of generating research findings here. What I did find is that at times ER strategies might be combined. And that's when, so as I said before, they all have inklings of all the bits in them, all the different strategies, but this is now when they really are pushing 2 strategies very explicitly. So here it's when there's a new object of study that is otherwise absent from the field, and because it offers a novel approach to get to that study. So both the ontic relations and discursive relations are emphasized. I'm just going to show you an example here. This is from a sociology PhD looking at fibromyalgia in patients. And she did a narrative study. So what she sets up the argument initially is saying that the perspective of the patient is absent entirely from what we know about this disease in South Africa. It's much more clinical. It's from a medical perspective. And what is missing actually is the patient perspective. So that would be the object of study. So strengthening of ontic relations. Then she goes on to say there's an inability. So she said there are sort of descriptions and that we know that these things exist, but there has been an inability in research to convert descriptions into useful, relatable explanations. So here she's starting to point to the fact that there's something about the way that the study is done. There's something going on there. And then she positions this study is this, the focus of this study speaks to those people who are unable to adhere to one particular sort of way of framing their illness and their experiences. And she says, I'm going to do it through an exploration of the narratives. So she's essentially setting up the fact that this object of study is missing. We're not hearing the patient perspective. Why aren't we hearing it? Well, there hasn't been a good way in the past to capture that in meaningful ways in research. What she is offering is saying, I can do this work because I have a method that's going to allow me to generate that kind of knowledge. So she's then saying, I can contribute this object of study because I have a method to do it. Right, so that was your ER. I'm going to push on, but stop me anyway. Right, when we're looking at social relations being strengthening, we can then think about those in terms of subjective relations and interactional relations. When subjective relations are strengthened, candidates are foregrounding qualities to do with knowers, who they are as a person. Do they generate legitimate knowledge because of who they are as an author? If it's downplayed, Then they downplay personal attributes of knowers. I didn't really find much of this in the studies. Interactional relations, when candidates strengthening, when candidates are foregrounding legitimate ways of knowing. So they're associating with different people's perspectives, other knowers in the field, significant knowers. And I'll show you how that comes across in some more examples. Downplaying interactional relations was when, interestingly, when candidates downplayed legitimate ways of knowing of themselves and or others, ways of knowing or other knowers in the field. And I didn't see much of this, but it was interesting when I did see it. And it was between, I must try and think now, it was a history PhD that was critiquing an anthropological historical point of view. And they were critiquing the way in which anthropologists come to know their object of study. And they made the argument that their historical gaze was more appropriate than the anthropological gaze. So I found that quite interesting. So they actually downplayed the anthropological gaze in that case. So let's just have a look at what these came across like. So when students were using the voices strategy, they were emphasizing something to do with themselves. And so those rationales really emphasize subjective relations to legitimate types of knowers. And I'll show you what I mean here. So this was the African Studies PhD again, where the author says, so she's the one looking at photographs of her family that she found in the attic. This particular candidate is someone from a racial category that we would call colored in South Africa. It is a identity that is claimed by the community. It doesn't, in this context, hold the very discriminatory associations like it would, say, in the USA. It is a category from the apartheid era, but it is a category that lives on in our social fabric here. So this candidate self-identified as a colored person, and I raise this because she was doing a study in a colored community in Cape Town, which were forcibly removed during apartheid. So they were in a very lovely part of Cape Town under the mountain. They were literally forcibly, physically removed to a different part because that was deemed a white area. So hugely, hugely traumatic. And she is writing this PhD on that trauma. So she is asking the research and the images that she's using as a data to assuage my past and to attend to my future and that of my son. We navigate our lives in a world that puts a price tag on our skins as I search for my search for relief, the injuries of my past that are going to free me, my experience. It's a very personal PhD. It's a very personal piece of research. She then goes on to explain that this is fundamentally a Black story. It's attendant to the violence and trauma that is embedded in the Black body. It's about the Black family. It's about my imaginings. And even the way she talks about literature was interesting, because while I thought this could be more of a sort of strengthening of interactional relations to significant knowers like Fanon, what I found here is she was really emphasizing who someone like Fanon was as a person. And that's why I coded it as stronger subjective relations. It's like a fundamentally lived experience, lived trauma, lived embodied knowledge. And she brings a legitimate perspective to the field because she is the legitimate knower of the subject. It is her trauma, it is her family, and that is why I've coded it as a subjective, very strong subjective relations. which is very different then to ways of knowing when interactional relations are being strengthened. This is legitimate ways of knowing, ways of interacting with others. And it's very much linked to key thinkers in the field. And it's very much aligned to who are they aligning with and who are they distancing themselves from in terms of scholars in the field and particular ways of thinking. So it's almost similar to discursive relations in that it's kind of the way in which they are engaging with knowledge. And it's sort of an approach to understanding a topic, but it's very much about individual ways of knowing rather than like, I'm going to use LCT theory or I'm going to use this narrative inquiry method or whatever it might be. And I'll show you an example to try and make that more explicit. So this is from an English literature PhD. And the author sets up, while drawing on literature, she's essentially setting up her gaze and making it clear how her gaze has been shaped over time through significant other authors in the field. So she says, although my emphasis is empirical, the studies of certain writers who are concerned with this topic have been useful. Writers such as Victor Turner's discussion, René Girard's work, and she's naming them in full, which I find quite significant. So the referencing style, and we know this from studies on referencing styles, that holds meaning in this context, the fact that she's naming them by both names. But here she goes on to say, even though she's named René Girard as someone important, she then starts to say his argument ultimately follows different line to mine. So she's sort of carving out a space to say where her way of knowing falls. This is also true of this other author. The other author talks about it this way. I'm going to talk about it in this other way. So what was interesting here is that the legitimate gaze being constructed through engagement with the literature review is not only she's not only showing her reader how her gaze has been shaped and what her gaze is, how she kind of aligns with this one and pushes that one away and says, it's kind of like this, but not that bit of his work, and it's kind of like this, but not that bit. So she's kind of taking the reader into how her gaze has been developed, because that gaze is going to enable her to come at her object of study in a particular way, and that is going to create legitimate findings. But in a way, she's also showing them that she knows she's a legitimate member of that field because she knows who the big people are. And she's saying, yeah, a little bit of that and a little bit of this. But it's kind of also showing that she is a member of that field. And I thought that was quite interesting. But the legitimacy of the thesis, the rationale of the thesis is that, because we know with stuff like English literature, quite often you have multiple studies on like the works of Coetzee, J.M. Coetzee. But it's the gaze that an author is bringing that's going to make the findings a little bit more distinct, a little bit more nuanced and legitimate in that field. So it's a really important part of that study. Unless, somebody finds a box of books in an attic that have never been studied before, then maybe it would be the more on tick. Right, so they can also combine. So you can make a rationale based on who you are and the way you know. So that's when we've got both subjective relations being strengthened and interactional relations. And I'll give you an example. This is a political studies PhD looking at, memory serves me right, same-sex marriage in South Africa. From a sort of political law kind of perspective. And here the author shows how her way of knowing, her gaze, has been shaped through many different theories and bodies of knowledge over time. So through feminism, through standpoint theory. She was an activist researcher, which comes with its own theories and scholars. ethics of care, philosophy of Ubuntu. So she spends a lot of time explaining how all these different ways of knowing, all these different significant scholars have shaped the way that she sees the world, the way she sees her object of study. But then she also, on the side, really pushes this idea that she is also a legitimate knower because she is a feminist lesbian who married a woman after decades of renouncing marriage. And that she's saying that this research is also her own story. And because she was interviewing same-sex couples, I then coded this as both the strengthening of interactional relations, the ways of knowing, and who she is as a person, because the sense I got from the writing is that she is saying, I'm legitimate. I can offer legitimate knowledge about this topic because I have immersed myself in this way of thinking, but also it's a lived experience for me. And I thought that she really sort of drove that point home. And I thought that was bringing something quite distinct to the study, that perhaps if like a straight man had done the study, he could, in theory, immerse himself in all of these theories, but there would be something fundamentally missing from the gaze based on who he is as a person. So that's why I coded it like this. Okay, so why am I even telling you all of this stuff? I feel like we've been on a very big tangent. So how am I trying to bring this?
Hang on,
Yes.
Kirstin. I've actually found you going through those concepts with your examples and how you coded them incredibly useful. Just to see how they're being operated in a different field from my own has been incredibly valuable. So don't think it's a detour at all. I've really enjoyed that. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lee.
What I wanted to just ask is, when you looked at all of these, were you looking at the ontic relations, the discursive relations, the subjective relations, and the interactional relations? Were you looking at all of them in all of the dissertations, or were you just looking at how they position themselves?
Yeah, I sort of did a soft eyes analysis first and sort of got a lay of the land, if you will. And I realized then that these four sort of big, broad categories were coming out. And then I went back and looked at them and then teased apart. And of course, they're all relational, right? So,
yeah.
So I had to put the boundaries over my data set. I've seen another study by colleagues in Sydney that have looked at creative arts PhDs, and they've coded some of them as knowledge codes. And if I had put them in my sample, they definitely wouldn't have been knowledge codes. They would have been definitely knower codes in relation to some of the other PhDs I had, for example. But I tried really hard to actually avoid coding the PhDs. Or even the section of the thesis. What I wanted to more get a sense of is what is being emphasized here versus what is being emphasized here, and why would you choose to emphasize something over something else? And what does that mean also for the rest of the study? Because if you're setting up a study as stronger discursive relations, if that's the rationale on which you're basing it on, and then the findings you sort of forget to use your theory, there's going to be like a conceptual alignment problem there. So it was more trying to understand what people were doing. I don't even know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And just one thing that I wasn't clear about, Were you looking at the rationale for the study or the kind of the whole literature review in this, these extracts that you brought in here?
Yeah, so I was looking, so what I did first, because all dissertations are so different, actually, no matter what the guidebooks tell you on how to write your PhD in 20 steps, I couldn't actually say this is a literature review, this is not. So what I did is I looked at, what do they all do? They all establish a rationale. They all identify a phenomena that they study. They all explain how they worked with that phenomena. They all construct findings, and they all show a contribution to the field. So I ditched all other categories, all other chapter names, and I worked with those 5 sections that had emerged from my data. And so when I say working with the rationale, that could be 3 chapters
bits and
worth,
pieces
it could
all
be
over.
1 chapter. Yeah. So it generally would have included the traditional sort of literature review, but probably also the parts of the introduction, maybe, depending on how they framed it. Yeah,
and
so it would have
my interest in this topic or whatever, that kind of
section. Because some people will also set up like a very personal thing at the beginning, saying like, this is how I came to the topic and this is why I'm engaging. But that's almost like a focus thing. It's like, this is what led me here.
Right.
But that's not necessarily why the findings are legitimate.
Yeah. Right.
So this was sort of digging a little bit deeper, is how are they setting this up in order to make claims to knowledge later?
Right.
And what's going to give them the legitimacy to make those claims later?
Thanks. That's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions at this point? Or should I keep going? I'm almost done.
No, I just wanted to say that I think it's a good point to not just sort of, like, you take something like we always described your objects of study, the PhDs, as being like a whale. They're a bunch of whales because they were so enormous, 80,000, 100,000 words long. And to say something like this PhD is this code just strikes me as being a bit, very reductive. If you think about, for example, as you'll know, Kirstin, the way in which I drum into people my desire for things to start from there's a real world problem out there, and then this generates an intellectual problem we don't know about, and therefore we need to do this intellectual thing in order to solve the rule. Then that's, so it's shifting the basis of legitimation in order to make points at different moments, so I think it's just a very good rhetorical strategy to grab people's attention with something they can share, which is there's a problem out there, not with, for example, the intellectual need, at least in the social sciences anyway, because people just dig into their approach and say, no, Foucault's enough. So I think, or whoever they like, Bourdieu or whatever. So yeah, I think it's right. There are different moments in the PhD, or big books, books and things like that, or even articles where different, kinds of codes are being sort of emphasized for particular purposes. They may shade over into being more knowledgey or knowery, but certainly even the knower code stuff tends to have some knowledgey code moments.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I did find that in the bigger study that they did sort of, some of them shifted and moved a little bit over time throughout the PhD. But certain bits, to get the alignment, that it made sense in the way that they had done it. It wasn't like a random shifting and drifting. But also what was interesting is how different PhDs can look from the same subject and even the same department. Like
I don't know why that would be
and
I don't know why. Having worked in a department for many, many millions of years, I don't know why that would be astounding at all, since me and my colleagues never speak to each other.
Yeah, but the guidebooks would lead you to believe that social sciences do this, humanities do this.
Nope.
It's much more complicated than that.
Which
is why it's such a dream to teach. Other comments or questions, or should I keep going with actually the crunch of, yeah.
Sorry, hi,
Come in,
Kirstin.
Karen.
What I'm finding absolutely fascinating, and I've made a note here for myself because it's really been bugging me, is that the gazes are so absent in STEM, let's say postgraduate theses, dissertations, etc. And this is problematic because what it means is that how it manifests is this are these generalizations or assumptions about the significance of a particular study, a STEM related study. And because the authors themselves, the researchers themselves are so absent or missing in there, they don't take, for example, global north, global south contexts into account, because there's just the assumption that, so this battery energy storage system will work for XYZ irrespective of context, and yet context becomes so important. And as you've been talking, and your analysis, particularly with regard to the interactional relations and the in terms of the gazes, gave me kind of an epiphanous light bulb moment of that's why the pressure from the world is for the development of more professional, socially conscious, so-called all those soft skill stuff in terms of engineering or STEM fields in general. And I think gaze is a bit of an answer here. So I'm just planting that seed now. I'll pick it up with you later. But I was going to say, I'm finding how you've done this fascinating for the writing of postgraduate theses and reports in the STEM space. There's a little bit of a missing link here. Thanks. Carry on.
Awesome. Yeah, I would like to take up that conversation actually, because I think it'd be super interesting. Because I think it gets to, and it's kind of like getting to the next slide here as well, just to round this off, is we know that writing is embedded in disciplinary context, and we know that disciplinary knowledge is reflected through the writing and is built through the writing because the writing then sustains it or whatever. But the sort of socialness of the knowledge and the people involved in the knowledge building is often so obscured in some disciplines that, and it's obscured in the writing for those particular reasons, because maybe they don't want it to be forefront and central. But yeah, it is there. It is, you do have a gaze. You're always going to be bringing a gaze to the writing. So yeah, I think we should chat more.
Kirstin,
Yes.
can I ask you a question? What you were talking about made me think of like autonomy tours. Perhaps this is more like a tour of gazes. So trying to highlight to students choices they can make in terms of moves, like where they might start and where they could go to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perhaps. I think it could potentially. I think it's also, though, about just making it explicit and making them realize that we do come with a gaze, but that writing and conventions sort of lead us to present that knowledge in particular ways. But it's not to say that it's not there. It's just we've chosen to represent it. And I think what Karen's saying there is really interesting, because if we're not questioning, essentially, even engineering students have interactional relations. They are engaging with different significant authors in the field, but there's no sort of critical engagement about where those critical authors are coming from and where that gaze is coming from. It's almost taken as a given. And I think in a lot of disciplines, it's almost taught as a given. Because batteries will store energy or whatever, maybe. It's kind of like the facts sort of lead, not the context of where the facts came from. And so maybe if we were a little bit more explicit about the gaze work, we could maybe bring those things to the fore. If for no other reason, to understand that they are being not misrepresented in writing, but that writing does choose a particular representation. I don't know what you make of that, Karen.
Kirstin, I want to pick up on what Grant just said, because I was just thinking in terms of the plane, the social plane and the gazes, that, okay, the big weakness in many of the postgraduate engineering related dissertations and theses is to make a compelling argument for whatever particular project they're working on in that STEM space, for the significance of it. And gazes linked to the idea of a tour are one way, in other words, to locate yourself. And I literally am thinking of the cultivated gaze position in terms of engineering is the acquisition of the discourses that you need to reproduce or use, technically sound and everything, in order to communicate what it is that you're working on. But there's kind of a social gaze. There's a, why does this matter to me and to us in the world more broadly? Maybe because we have an energy crisis on the continent. Let's say, to stick with the battery energy storage systems question, which is totally different from, let's say, what it is in the global north. So I'm thinking that a sounder argument for why a particular research project in an engineering context matters to the person doing it within their context and to the significance for the world out there. They always have to explain the significance. And they end up explaining significance in terms of this is an optimized system and it's far more efficient. But for whom? And they always leave that out. And when you interrogate it, you'll find it's not an optimized system for everyone. We have major contextual differences. So in other words, I'm thinking, as per what Grant has just said, the idea of a tour to locate in your writing a rationale for STEM related things, which feels to those people as so knowledgey. There are these huge knowery things, and you could literally help someone articulate the coherence of their argument and the significance of what they're doing, I think, by using social relations, kind of in the way that you've been describing. We can pick up this conversation, but thanks, Grant, for that, because I like the idea of also the tour. That's all I have to say. Go.
Right, should I keep going? And then
Yes, keep going.
Cool. All right. So just to try and bring this back to this damn argument that I'm trying to build for this paper is what does LC actually bring to academic literacy theory? And I think it does provide practical insight that academic literacy doesn't offer, because we talk about disciplinary difference and we talk about identity work, but we don't actually know what that really tangibly is, and we don't know what that looks like in texts. And I think doing an analysis like I've just showed you, it gets at some of those disciplinary things that are going on, because it allows us to look at texts and look at different ways of representing knowledge, different ways of building rationales, different ways of legitimizing particular things over others. And then I think once we can see that, we can start asking, well, to what goal? So if you are going to if you're going to strengthen subjective relations, why would you do that? What would that mean in a particular context? Would that be appropriate in all contexts? And then you can sort of open up those conversations. This is what it looks like. Why would you do it? What does it afford? Why would you strengthen discursive relations? What is it about that kind of research problem that would require that? When would you do that? Would that be appropriate? It can open up those kinds of conversations that sort of bring it, it's still pretty abstract, but it's a little bit more tangible than just the idea that disciplinary knowledge and disciplinary homes have different conventions and that we are asking students to become a particular kind of knower. And I think particularly at PhD level, when you are actually needing to claim ownership over a project and really sort of, yeah, I mean, you need to know what you're doing with that knowledge and what makes your understandings of that knowledge legitimate or not. And then, as I haven't quite got here yet, I did have a conversation with Steve after LC5, which was really useful, but I think these analytical distinctions, or these sort of strategies, as I've conceptualized them, can inform pedagogic development. I haven't done it yet myself. I think I've been a bit scared to jump off the ledge into the unknown, but I think it could. Whether that's a wide-scale pedagogic approach, I don't know. Maybe it needs to start smaller while I refine it. I don't know yet if it would be more appropriate for students or to actually be working with supervisors. My natural inclination would tend towards supervisors first. Carl,
just try it.
Try it.
Just try it. Just try it out. Like with, medicine is mostly suck it and see. Just try it out.
Yeah, I think, like I said at LCT5, Kirstin, what you've presented here gives you the basis for a session, either with supervisors or with students. If you could do a lovely kind of inductive based session where students or supervisors are looking at different examples of these texts, the examples that you've presented, and then they could be asked to sort of discover for themselves how are these creations of rationales, like doing things differently. How are each of these examples valuing different kinds of things? How would you articulate those? How would you label those? And have a sort of discovery-based session where the students they discover for themselves essentially they discover the 4K for themselves, or the supervisors discover the 4K for themselves, and they may come up with slightly different labels. But then you can kind of say, okay, here's how I thought about it. Here are my labels. So they could be kind of led to your research findings almost. And your labels are quite simple ones: voices, ways of knowing. Those are quite accessible. You don't need to be talking about discursive relations or similar.
Yeah.
I think that would be a fantastic session to then say, okay, there may be other ways of thinking about this, but here are 4 major strategies. Some of them may be combined. Let's go to your work. Let's think about that. And then even kind of the idea of the tour. How do you get there in different parts of your thesis? How might you come back to these different ways of legitimizing your own contributions to knowledge? I think everything that you've given us today and at the conference kind of gives you everything that you need for a session like that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think I just need to be brave and give it a go. Because what I think it's also quite useful in understanding is the structure you would then use in a PhD. Because if you are working like that African Studies PhD, where the whole thesis has been set up that she is the legitimate knower of that topic, it wouldn't make sense then to have a methodology chapter. I mean, what are you going to talk about in your methodology chapter? I mean, she could, but it's going to be shortened. It's not going to be like an LCT methodology chapter that's got translation devices and all sorts of things. Because I think a lot of students open up, and I know I'm harping on about it, and some are much better than others, so don't get me wrong, but you open up an average guide that you would find in the library, and you get given a structure, and you get told what to do. And I think it can become quite paralyzing for students and potentially supervisors, novice supervisors, where you're like, well, this doesn't really work to have a long methodology chapter, but actually it's not necessarily appropriate. And I can't tell you that it's going to be this discipline's going to have it and this one's not. It's going to depend on what you're doing with and the kind of knowledge you're building. And I think that's what these tools are really useful for, because they are flexible.
I mean, not to be critical, because they're doing a hard job, but there's 2 types of books I have never found of use as a researcher, as a PhD student as well, which was books on methods, which have absolutely nothing to do with actually doing research, because no method ever worked the way I've read about it in a book. And books about how to write PhDs and things like that, or structure stuff. I've never found personally, I've never found them helpful. There's bits in there here and there, but you know, you wonder why your thing doesn't want to fit their template, as it were. And you know, to be able to say this is this way because of this, or this is that way because of that, and it has these flow-on effects, I think will be really useful, particularly since LCT does not or should not involve some sort of judgment as to which is best or worse, or you know, which way is the right way.
Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah, so I think this is actually me. Oh, significance. Here we go. The significance of all of this. Well, we just need more and more support for this stuff. And we need a practical way in. For someone like me working in this environment, the lofty ideals are amazing, and I need them to think beyond the practical constraints, but I also need the practical stuff coming in, and I think LCT really does. It operationalizes a lot of the things that academic literacy speaks to but can't really get at. And then, as we've just been discussing, it has a bit of pedagogic potential as well. So that's kind of where I am. And I guess maybe just to end, the reason why I really wanted to make this argument is because academic literacy, Street, G, Mary Lee, Leah, they are powerful voices still in academic development in South Africa. And I think LCT is such a good partner in crime here. It really helps to take these understandings further, and I think we've got to a stage now where the critique of the deficit discourses that used to be here, I mean, there are lots that are still here, let's be sure, but I feel, maybe Karen, you'll think differently, or I don't know, but I feel like there's quite a big body of scholars, a group of scholars, should I say, a body of research that is, it's kind of like we know that those deficit discourses are problematic and whatever, and we are moving past them, even though they do exist in spaces. But I'm feeling the frustration of I need something more. And I think particularly in the academic development work I do with students, but also with staff, they need the tangible things. For instance, I ran an academic literacy course here called Writing the University Ways of Knowing, Ways of Doing. And it's got a lot of LCT embedded into it. And the staff come away from that with their eyes open. There've been lots of light bulb moments. I think it's been a really successful course. But what I've been finding is they leave having this really wonderful insight into their disciplines, being able to talk about their practice really well. So I'm setting them up to write a teacher portfolio really well. But then they get back into their class and they're struggling to sort of take that insight into practical things in their classroom. And I'm feeling like that's been my sort of failure or learning curve, let's put it like that more positively, is in helping them and learning myself actually along the way of how do you translate these really interesting, useful insights into very practical, workable, not plug in and play, but kind of plug in and play. That's very theoretically grounded. So that's kind of the challenge of where I'm heading to in my work. And I'm more and more, I just think this offers something really useful. And having the text-based approach still here, I think is really important. I think we can't just sit around and talk about identity work and tell students that they are taking on new identities and then expect them just to get on and do it. So I probably should have started with that, but anyway, I'll end with that. That's why I'm doing this work. Cool. That's all from me. So
Thanks,
any
Kirstin.
other comments?
Yeah, if anybody wants to just jump in, just unmute yourself and say something.
I'll stop sharing so we can all see each other nicely.
Kirstin, sorry.
Mm.
So when I see everyone else waiting, I wait 30 seconds and then I feel sorry for you in the silence and then I jump in. Anyway,
I'm
I
happy
don't want to
with the
hog
silence.
it.
I'm a real teacher
Someone
now.
else needs to talk over me if you want to, but I was going to say, every single year I get called into, oh my God, these postgrads in engineering can't write. So I do the same. And I haven't explicitly used a Steve kind of approach or what you're doing in terms of actually teaching the postgrads to use these tools. It's implied in what I'm doing, but I work with their supervisors, the staff, the same as you, academic development. And now I'm hearing those staff members saying to me, Karen, I've forgotten everything you did with us on the program. And precisely that disjuncture, that thing of when they're with me in it and it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking going forward as a strategy, that maybe one of the things is literally to go into the classroom with them after they've done these programs and things like that, record little snippets of what they're doing, or at least do an annotated or a descriptive journey of how they're teaching, and then take them back to the tools, which they've all learned in any case. I mean, I have everybody doing insight tours, okay, and the curriculum is planned, and some people take to it immediately. And it just becomes, it's like all of us. When you see, you can't unsee. That's the challenge you're facing. How do I keep what I saw there as part of my seeing and being? And maybe we can chat about that, because I have exactly the same challenge, So thanks so much. That was brilliant.
That'd be really great.
Kirstin, can I add to that as well? Several years ago, I ran a similar sort of session on a 2-weekly basis where I would get together with a bunch of students, teachers, not students, my students, not but teachers in a high school, and we would talk about something, and usually I'd produce a paper or something and we'd read it together and I'd talk about the concepts in it. And they would take away one idea and the next 2 weeks later they might say, I had a go at that. And the thing that I realised after a long time is that it was this, they cannot remember 30 different good ideas at once, and they certainly can't insert 30 different good ideas at once into a program. It's a really, really gradual process, but it did work, and gradually they'd come back and say, oh, now I do that, and it became part of their DNA. But it took years. So that group ran for 2 years. Every fortnight, every 3 weeks, we would have a meeting and chat about something, and it just was a really gradual process. And all of them kept coming back. That was the interesting thing. There's a teachers giving up their time after school to do an extra little bit of study with me that they got no credit for at all, apart from me signing off on their self-developed PL. But that's how it worked. So, just keep going. That's what I would say. Just keep going.
Thank you.
One bit at a time.
Yeah. No, you're right though. Academics just make the worst students as well. They're busy people, and I think I've actually been reconceptualizing that course to be 2-day workshops with some prior asynchronous stuff, and then kind of what you're getting at, but it makes me think it needs to be more active, but sort of nuggets that they can tap into on a regular basis afterwards. Because to have people sit in a room for a week, because that's how we normally do our AD work, is they come for a course for a week, sit in a room, and it's really great for that week if they can give up the time to be there, which is not always the case, but it's a lot of information all at once. So I'm hoping this new way of sort of spreading it out, sort of packaging the materials a little bit differently, and giving them opportunities to actually go back in the class and then come back and back in the class and come back might work. So thank you for the encouragement.
So I just wanted to comment, Kirstin, that for me, it's lovely to just hear this again and hear all of the rich conversation around it through Grant and Karen and Lee's comments and so on. But what was new for me today was the point that you made sort of towards the end, which I hadn't thought about when I heard this the first time, about how those choices around orientations towards the ontic relations or the social relations shape other decisions, or should shape other decisions in the thesis. And that's quite a powerful takeaway for me. Your example of a sort of a very subjective relations oriented claim to legitimacy as then shaping the kind of methodology, the need for a methodology, the length of the methodology, that seems really powerful to me. And I mean, obviously, the critique of academic literacies as ignoring the text is taken up by applied linguists, by EAP specialists, and there are ways of identifying identity markers and so on through looking at language. And you can take you can get to social practices of the disciplines also by looking at language and looking at sort of textual decisions and so on. But what you can't get at is that you can't get at how the linguistic or textual choices in one part of a thesis shape the decisions that for another part. And that's clearly where LCT can kind of come in and do something quite powerful. So that, I don't know if that makes sense, but that was a that was a really useful takeaway for me today. And the other thing, I mean, to me, I can like immediately see the workshop that I would run kind of using this stuff. I really want to try it. I don't do a lot with PGR students directly myself, but I have a couple of colleagues that run a kind of year-long program, which is ostensibly for international postgraduate students, research postgraduate students. And I know that they do a session on the literature review. And it's really tempting to go and to say to them, right, I want to hijack this session. And then I want to have a kind of have a go at talking about these other things and putting these things in as well. So if I manage to do that, then I'll be in touch for advice, and you know, maybe you can kind of come and, I don't know, virtually advise or something, or I can show you what I came up with and see if it's useful.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love that, Steve, to collaborate with you. Be good, because also, I mean, the way that you engage with literature is going to be shaped. You could use this tool to help you work out what are you going to be focusing on. If you're strengthening discursive relations as a rationale, then when you engage with literature, you're going to be needing to pay attention to the discursive relations in other, you know, the approaches used in other literature. If you are motivating that you are the significant knower, the legitimate knower, you're likely going to have to show other knowers in the field and position yourself as being more legitimate to them or whatever, you know. So it definitely does shape the way you engage.
And I wonder whether, I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of the PhD process, to think about when it is that a candidate reaches an understanding that that's what they're doing, even if it's implicit. You know, the ability to write something that stakes your claim to legitimacy in terms of whichever of those four strategies is open to people. You know, when do people reach that? I guess some people reach it earlier than others. Some people may reach it through their literature review. There may be some candidates, perhaps particularly those with the stronger subjective relations, who start off knowing that that's the story that they want to tell, even before they've engaged with the literature and so on. So maybe, you know, so I don't have an answer to that. I'm just kind of thinking aloud. But you know, in terms of thinking about having a session that works for people, you know, students probably reach a state of understanding at different points, maybe, in terms of what they bring into the discipline and so on. Yeah,
some might just be, I mean, we all are there at some stage where you not pretending is a loaded word, but you sort of learn by looking at others, and I'm not convinced all PhD graduates know exactly what was potting. I think some people sort of stumble their way through it and get to the end, and it's passing, like, whew, and you leave that alone.
And it's often quite performative, right? Students often know that they have to kind of produce this contribution to knowledge. They need to have this kind of niche. They need to have this statement that says how my thesis is going to be different from others. And I think it's often performed rather than kind of genuinely embodied in how they think about their research.
Yeah. Good. Any other comments or questions?
It is interesting how people often think it's because something hasn't been looked at before, and then have a nervous breakdown when they see a book on the same topic. I mean, I used to do that every time I walked into Headfirst in Cambridge and see yet another book on the history of cultural studies, which was the original PhD I did 3/4 of, then threw away. Rather than realizing it's a problem situation, which is an object of study plus some questions, you know, and you can have very different questions, and how you're doing, you know, it's like there's something more than just a topic. I have no interest in ever reading anything that ever says, personally, that says, I'm doing this because it's not been written about before. I'm like, well, doesn't mean I have to read it. But when there's a problem, so that's a very different kind of thing to, you know, the problem will require more than just the ontic relations being emphasized. You know, there's got to be something else. The problem situation does require something to do with the discursive relations, because problems are constructed by theories.